How's everyone doing today? My name is Yupari, and in this week's video, along with the portrait painting demonstration, I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the changes that I'm going to implement on my portrait painting videos. These changes are based on comments that all of you have left for me, and I'm trying to do the best that I can to cater to everyone's needs, but it seems to be that the common trend is that everyone wants to see the picture of the model throughout the entire painting, and so I'm going to do that with this video. There's going to be a picture of the model throughout the entire painting, and I'm also going to have little close-ups here and there as well. Another change that I'm going to implement that you may have noticed in my last painting video is the palette setup has changed now. I have my palette to the left of my canvas, and this is because you wanted to see more of my palette mixtures in about the same lighting as my painting. So there you have it. And while I have the palette up right there for you, I'm going to read the colors from left to right. So I'm going to have 2 dots of titanium white, 1 dot of my lead white, which is Winsor & Newton zinc white, raw umber, burnt umber, alizarin crimson, cadmium red light, cadmium orange, yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, sap green, ultramarine blue, and ivory black. Another change that I will be implementing is that I will be giving you now a specific time at which I will be releasing new portrait painting videos. Saturday mornings, there you have it. Saturday mornings, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Remember, this is a learning process for me, so it is my goal to make each video better than the last. Alright, now for my odorless mineral spirits, to the left I have just a regular odorless paint thinner. To the right, I have a 1/5 paint thinner mixture to 4/5 stand oil mixture, and that will be my medium. But you won't see that cup throughout the rest of the video. Getting started here, I like to use my size 4 filbert brush. Size 4 filbert brush with a little bit of paint thinner, probably about maybe 5% paint thinner to 95% paint. And I'm going to be using raw umber for my drawing color. And I did tone this canvas with a mixture of titanium white and burnt umber acrylic just to try out a different tone surface. So here I am. I'm trying to loosely block in the outside shape of the model's head, and I'm trying to simplify it into just a few basic straight lines and angles to get an idea of the positioning of the head in space. I find that it's important in the start to hold the brush on the back end, hold the end of the brush and work through your arm, meaning try not to draw so much with your wrist or be too close to the surface. I think that in the beginning it's pretty important to stand at least an arm's length away from your canvas or panel or whatever you're working on, and be a little bit loose and gestural in the start, so that you don't start afraid. It's not good to start afraid. It's good to have some confidence and work in there, starting out knowing that it's going to be a little bit scary in the beginning, but just telling yourself that, you know, it's just a painting. I'm trying to keep myself organized, and I'm trying to keep my steps in such a way that I understand what I'm doing. So what I have is a basic outside shape of the model's head and a basic shape for the entire structure of the model's face. Now, a basic shape meaning that I know that it's not completely a perfect outline, and I don't want it to be. I just want it to be something that I can identify and work with. And so what you see, that cross looking thing in the middle, is actually the center line of the model's face. That the model is tilted up a little bit in perspective relative to me. So that center line is going to help me establish exactly what is the tilt that the model is making relative to me. And I have the axes for the eyes, the nose, and the mouth indicated with just a simple line. And I'm going to now start to loosely draw in the light and shadow shapes. I'm going to be spending quite some time trying to figure out the proportions and the light and shadow shapes using just my raw umber color for my drawing and my size 4 filbert bristle brushes. I'm going to have a drawing brush and an eraser brush that you saw me using before, and I'm using it right now at the moment. The eraser brush is a clean bristle brush that's a little bit more beat up, dipped in a tad bit of my odorless mineral spirits, and then tried to dry it as much as I can so that I don't have too much of my odorless paint thinner on my eraser brush, but just a little bit allows me to push the paint around, sort of like a kneaded eraser would with a piece of soft fine charcoal. And so I'm going to be lightly etching in the simple shapes of light and shadow. Notice that my start is very easy to understand, just shapes of light and dark, center line for the tilt of the head, and a basic shape for the outside of the head. And I'm trying to work in this way so that I can understand where I'm at relative to the overall drawing and the overall placement of all of the features of the model's face. And I'm working in this way because I know that for me in particular, this pose is going to be quite difficult to draw. So that's why I'm spending a lot of time with my drawing color, my drawing brush, and my eraser brush, trying to figure out as closely as I can the exact tilt that the model is making and the exact light and shadow shapes, but still in a rather simplified manner. Now I'm starting to introduce a few more lines into the outside shape of the model's face. Now at this point I am trying to, with some degree of accuracy, figure out a little bit more of an articulated outside shape now for the side of the model's face, but I know that I'm not going to be able to get the exact outline right away. And so I'm working with my straight lines and angles and just trying to approximate where everything is. And at this point, I'm just trying to gather information. I'm pretty certain on this tilt now for the head, so I'm going to start to further refine the shapes within the structure of the model's face. By refine, I mean I'm going to start adding a few more bits of information now, as opposed to the axis of the eyes, that line that we had. Now I'm going to have a shape for the eye socket, a little mark there for the tear duct. So a mark from one tear duct and then a mark to the other tear duct will help me also reinforce that angle that is existing within the two eyes. That is the angle of the two eyes, and I know I'm not going to get it right right away. I know that it's going to look kind of goofy and kind of funky in the beginning, but I'm just trying to get something down. I'm just trying to have some type of drawing there so that I can build on top of it. Remember, drawing is just, you can think of drawing as just a series of corrections. You can think of drawing as problem solving, and I'm going to try to do that as much as I can and as honestly as I can with myself, and not get too fed up with the fact that it's not completely accurate right away. That's why I want to work from general to specific, so I can give myself enough room to work with the basic shapes so that I can further build and articulate more complicated shapes on top of them. As I start to subdivide my shapes now into more and more simplified shapes, I want to also talk a little bit about the idea of copying. Now I'm not, I don't, in my head, I don't like to think about copying. I'm not trying to copy what I'm looking at. I'm trying to distill it into a simple set of information that I can gather from the model. Now, I'm trying to create a realist portrait painting in such a way that it resembles the model, but at the same time, I'm trying to explore what is going on in the visual realm, so to speak. I'm trying to see uh, what is in front of me and uh, break it down into a simple set of basic shapes of straight lines and angles, and then as the painting progresses into values and colors. But I'm keeping in my mind that I'm drawing the pose, not the model. I'm creating a painting and not a photograph. I'm a human being. I am going to make mistakes. I'm never going to have a perfect drawing. I'm never going to have a perfect painting. That just, I'm a human. I'm not a robot. It's not going to happen. So really, I enjoy the process. It's kind of like handing me a puzzle and having me figure out where the puzzle pieces go. I enjoy that, and at the same time, I put a little bit of myself into the painting, and I believe that we all do. We all put a little bit of our own touch, our own handwriting, our own calligraphy into the work that we are creating, and that to me is more important than any kind of accuracy. That to me is more important than any kind of photographic perfect drawing, is that bit of yourself that you put into your drawing or put into your painting. And as I work uh, around these simple shapes, uh, my calligraphy, so to speak, will eventually emerge. And I don't know what that is. I don't know exactly what my touch looks like. I don't know what that looks like. Other people may point it out to me. It may be in the way that I break down the shapes. Everyone has their own type of calligraphy. Everyone has their own type of voice. Everyone has their own type of mark, and that type of elegance and variety is what makes portrait painting and painting in particular such a beautiful thing, that vast variety. And I don't want to detach too much from that idea of the beauty comes from within the observer's the way that the observer breaks down what they're looking at in front of them into this two-dimensional surface. So let's keep that in mind as I start to subdivide these shapes now into more concise and understandable shapes. Still trying to keep it very simple and very organized, but let's just keep that in mind, that we're trying to create a painting and not a picture. I've been told this several times. Why am I painting? Why don't I just take a photograph? I like the process. That's going to be my response to that criticism. I like the process. I love old master paintings. I love Sargent paintings. I love Zorn's paintings, Savoy's paintings. I even love Monet and Renoir and Manet's impressionist work. I love that we human beings are able to observe nature and distill it into simple pieces of information with a human touch that's not so photographic. And and there's nothing wrong with having a photographic looking image. Nothing wrong with it at all, but there's always that human touch to it. Even if you look at a Chuck Close painting, there's always that human touch that goes into it. Even though Chuck Close could be thought of as a hyper-realist, there's always that touch that goes in to the uh, painting process. It's important for me to get these light and shadow shapes as well established as I possibly can, especially in this early stage of the painting. I find that if you break things up too soon, the overall image tends to get lost. Um, and I don't know, I don't think that's the case for everyone, but certainly for me, uh, when I'm dealing with a complicated task like this one in front of me, the model is in three-quarter view, but the three-quarter turn is fairly close to being centered. What I'm trying to say is that the pose is with her head is tilted up, and she's turned at a three-quarter view. That's more, I think it's closer to center than it is to profile. Center being directly centered towards you, and profile being completely to the side of the picture plane. And so I knew right away that this pose would be very difficult to draw, especially if I started out in the way that I do some of my paintings, where I loosely sketch the block in and then dive right into paint. So this is a technique that I tend to use when I'm confronted with what I perceive to be a difficult drawing. And I do think that this drawing, at least for me, is a little more difficult than some of my other paintings that I've done. And so I'm taking great care with each and every shape. Now I'm not trying to over articulate any of these shapes. As you see, I'm still trying to keep my mark making rather simple, but keeping myself at arm's length, at least away from the painting, helps me to see the most essential bits of information. And a lot of folks ask me, how do I know what to put in and what to leave out? Oftentimes, it helps me to bounce my eyes back and forth between my painting and the model and squint my eyes and only put down what I see. So there's an optical way to figure it out. And then another answer to that question would be, what is the most essential towards creating this image? And as I mentioned before, it's light and shadow. So simple shapes of light and shadow and somewhat of an accurate placement relative to the model's true proportions is what I'm after. And I'm leaving everything else out, all of the information in the light. I'm not thinking about it at the moment. I'm purely thinking about simple shapes of light and shadow. Now, of course, with my eraser brush, not every mark comes off of the surface so neatly. You notice that line for the center line. I can't really get rid of it, but that's alright. I'm going to be going into the painting with color in this session, so I'm going to be completing the entire painting for you. But it's alright if some of the lines are left in this initial phase. Now, I recommend to the viewer, if you are just now getting started, to do exactly what I've done right here at this current stage with either a piece of soft vine charcoal on a piece of pastel paper, or just a graphite pencil, just a regular pencil on a drawing pad. This stage right here of simple shapes of light and shadow is the oftentimes the most neglected thing that I've seen in most students. It's taking that time to fully digest and fully understand the simple shapes of light and shadow. I promise you, if you spend your time trying to train your eye to see simple shapes of light and shadow, and study anatomical structures along with that understanding, you will inevitably improve your abilities. Now let's move on to values. It's important to know that value is the most essential tool, the most fundamental tool that the artist can use to describe form. And what I mean by describe form, I mean that, as I mentioned many times before, if that were not true, then black and white photography would not be able to hold an image. And if that were not true, then drawings themselves would not be able to exist. And so we can do a great deal of, we can describe a great deal of form with the idea of value in mind. It's value that creates the entire form for you, not color. And I know that I've aggravated several people by saying that. And I know it's a very controversial thing to say, but it is what it is. If value itself did not describe form, then black and white photography wouldn't work, and pencil drawings, charcoal drawings would not work either. And also, as I talk about this, if you have any confusion with the colors that I'm using, just feel free to zoom the video, scroll back and forth, and you will always see my palette there, and you can see exactly which colors that I use for which particular mixture. But in any case, being able to first simplify what you're looking at in front of you in terms of simple shapes of light and shadow is the most important, in my opinion, tool that the artist can use in the start, and it's most important in the start. And then as we progress along the rest of the painting, if we want to have a painting that has a sense of form, then the value is going to be the way to obtain it. And so whenever I'm mixing a color, what goes on in my mind first and foremost is, what is that value? So let's talk a little bit about the values that I've introduced. So I have a simple flat mass. A mass is just a region of value. I have a simple flat mass of value for the dark of the hair, and it is fairly dark, but it's not straight black. So you can zoom into the colors that I used for that mixture if you'd like, but I believe it was a mixture of my burnt umber, raw umber, ultramarine blue, and I probably lightened it up with a little bit of the yellow ochre. But in any case, that was my reasoning for the hair. Now I did leave some darker areas in the hair where there would be less light. Now that was pretty much just to optimize my time. That being said, I left some darker regions closer to the ear where the hair is turning further away from the light. And with the form shadow now, the shadow on the side of the model's face, I started out with, first of all, thinking in my head, okay, it's dark. It's fairly dark, and it's pretty close to the value of the hair, but it's a little bit lighter. And so that was what happened in my head. And then I went on to decide, okay, that color is a little bit warm. It's not completely brown, but it's pretty warm, a little on the greenish side. And so that was my reasoning for the color. And then I applied the color. And so now I'm starting to build into the colors and the values for the face. Now, if you've seen many of my videos before, you'll notice common trends here. I tend to say I'm going to be introducing a warmer, darker value in the flesh, or I'm going to be building up from my darker values all the way to my lighter values. These are common trends in how I start. But with this painting, I'm going to be, of course, as you can see, I'm working my way up from the darker tones on the face, but at the same time I'm also considering the structure and the planes of the face a little bit more in this stage than I normally would. Normally I would color the entire face with just one darker, warmer pass of color, but just recently started to introduce a little bit more variety and structural information earlier on into the first pass of the skin tones on the model's face. Still thinking very much about only concerning myself with the values. First and foremost, I'm still going to be introducing some warmer tones now into the flesh. There are regions that are going to be inevitably much warmer than others, like the cheek or the nose, and of course the lips. So those regions in my head I'm going to, of course, make warmer, uh, but as I work my way around with this first uh, layer of thin paint, I'm trying to make my value changes based on the planar relationships, the planes. Remember, a plane is a simplified concept of a three-dimensional flat sheet of paper, if you will, and a three-dimensional area. So a plane, you could think about it as a door facing a single light source. That flat sheet containing the door is the plane. And as we move the door to a more opened or closed position, you can picture that the light on the door will be changing in value relative to the position of the light source. And so that is what creates different value transitions on the model's face is the local plane, the local positioning of the plane relative to the light source. So I'm very much thinking of the spatial relationships between each area of the model's face now and the light source. Now remember, shadows are usually parallel to your dominant light source, and highlights are most perpendicular to the light source. So that can give you kind of a reference as to where all of the other planes fit in space. And I'm not applying too much paint onto the surface right away. I'm more or less trying to build up my surface. Now I am using lots of paint on my palette, as you can see. I apologize for the glare there. But I'm using a lot of paint on the palette. But the way that I'm applying the paint onto the surface of the canvas is that I'm not applying too much pressure right away onto the surface. I'm more kind of whispering the paint onto the surface, kind of feathering it on so that I can build this first pass of color with those planes that I mentioned in mind, so that I can have more of a detailed underlayer for my future passes of paint. My future layers of paint will be more accurate in terms of the color as well as the construction of the values and the structures as well. I should also note I did switch now to my synthetic brushes. So if you followed along from the beginning, I started out with a size 4 filbert bristle brush, and now for the majority of this filling in of color, if you will, I'm going to be using size 4 filberts, but they're going to be synthetic brushes now. Synthetic brushes are a little bit thinner and a little bit they're easier to move around. They don't shovel the paint around as much. So back to the values, let's get a little inside look on what's going on in my mind in this current stage of the painting. So I'm looking at the model and I see that the right side of the face, is a little bit lighter, in value relative to the left side of the face. And I'm talking, okay, the right side of the face, I mean relative to the canvas. So that's what I mean by the right side of the face. So the area of the face to the right of the canvas is a little bit lighter than the area of the face to the left of the canvas. Could this be because of the placement of the light relative to the model's face? Yes, that is exactly what's causing that change in value. And let's look again another area now. The area, let's see, to the left of the model's lips is also getting a little darker. And yeah, you guessed it, that's because it's turning further away from the light. Now there are bits and pieces here that are receiving more light, like the area to the left of the model's lip receiving more light, and the chin receiving more light as well, even though it's a little bit lower and further away from the light physically. The plane is still facing the light even more. So now let's get a little more into my thought process here. Of course, I'm thinking of not ruining this painting for you all. I'm trying to do the best that I can. So in my head, I'm thinking, oh, please, I don't want to ruin this painting. But at the same time, I'm thinking, what is each large area of value relative to the other areas of value? And so the forehead is lighter than the left side of the model's face, but it's not as light as the right side of the model's face near her cheek. Her chin is receiving more light than the side of her mouth, so I'm relating each large area of value relative to each other. And with color, not very much is going on in my head at this point because I know that I'm going to come back in and further refine the color. But I am using quite a bit of my cadmium red mixed with a little bit of my sap green. I know that they're complementary, but I like the way that they neutralize, and I feel like they make a nice a flesh tone. The cadmium red with sap green, a little bit of the zinc white, cooling it down even more with the burnt umber. So yeah, I am thinking a little bit about the color mixtures as well. But at this stage of the painting, my mind is entirely focused, almost entirely focused, on the overall large areas of value relative to one another. And remember that the light and shadow shapes are the foundation of which all of this is going to rest on. I made an analogy before to the development of a house, and I'm going to do it again. So the light and shadow shapes, you can think of it as the scaffolding to a house, the scaffolding to a building. Without that underlying scaffolding, without that underlying structure, the further additions like the doorknob, the sink, the shower head, the living room, the dining room to that house have nowhere to go. Where am I going to put the kitchen sink? Where am I going to put the doorknob? Where am I going to put the window if I don't have a foundation to the house? And so now let's relate that to the painting. So the underlying foundation was the light and shadow shapes. And from that now I'm starting to build more and more shapes on top of that. So you could think of this light right now on the model's cheek as kind of like a dining room. You can think of the forehead as the kitchen, the chin as the you can say the hot tub. Let's place a hot tub in this house. You can think of the pupil, the small little region of the pupil, as the doorknob. And all of these pieces are fitting into this underlying scaffolding. So if that foundation isn't accurate enough, and I'm not going to know where to place any of these smaller forms, I just won't know. Now let's further extend that house analogy here. So there's a interrelationship between each large region of value on the model's face relative to one another. Let's think about the house now. Each and every room in the house needs to take up just enough space that all of the rooms together, all of the spaces together make up the entire house. If any one of those rooms is not in the right proportion, it may not fit in the house. And you can see where I'm kind of going with this, hopefully. Uh, if the region of value on the light side of the face is in the wrong relation relative to the shadow, meaning that if any of the values, any of the light values on the face are anywhere near as dark as any of the values in the shadow, then that area no longer exists in the light side of the face. Kind of like designing a blueprint to a house and making the dining room larger than the entire house itself. It just doesn't work. So that is analogous to maintaining all of your values in the light and all the values in the shadow in the shadow. Now, I'm not a perfectionist. I do have a dark light on the side of the nose at this point, a little too dark relative to everything else. So I am kind of screwing that up at that stage. But that's all right. I mean, it's not, the development of a painting does not have to be such a linear progress. It doesn't have to be such a linear progression. Sometimes we have to make a few mistakes and then come back in and with a fresh eye reestablish where we are. That's all right. And so now I should also mention that I'm using my size 0 round brushes, and these brushes are fairly inexpensive brushes that I picked up at a local art store. They are size 0 round synthetics, and I do separate my light brush from my dark brush just so that the cleaning of the brush doesn't take as much time. So I reestablished the pupil with a different color now, and now I'm putting in some highlights for the pupils of the eyes using just the flesh mixture that I had with a little bit more of the cadmium yellow and some of the lead white, the zinc white, and I'm going to use that now to put a little highlight indication on the nose as well. With each addition of value and color onto the light side of the face now, I'm trying to further subdivide all of my larger shapes now into smaller shapes, all of my larger, more general shapes into now smaller and more specific shapes, so that the form still reads far away. I want this painting to look its best, say maybe 5 or 10 feet away, and that is, I feel like I can only gain that through taking my time with the simple shapes of light and shadow and the simple shapes of value on the face. Not too many values on the face, but just enough to depict where each plane is relative to that given light source. And I explained that a little bit earlier using that door analogy. The angle of the door relative to the light source will tell you how light or how dark the door itself should be. So with each one of these planes now that I'm placing, remember the plane as just indicated by the value change, with each one of these little value changes, I'm still pretty much thinking about that large shape and subdividing each shape, looking at the eye socket as it turns around the eye now at this point. I'm starting to use my smaller brush to make that turn of value. It's getting darker as it rolls across the side of the face, just a little more subtle now as I start to apply more and more values. Now I'm working on the transition of value as we roll across the top plane of the nose into the side of the nose. Now I'm trying to think of how that surface, notice how I apply the paint. I'm trying to think of how that surface, at what degree is this surface turning away from the light. If it's a more rapid turn, then it will go from light to dark much faster. If it's a more subtle turn, like look at the area of the forehead, the change from light to dark is much more subtle than the transition from light to dark on the nose. Notice that that's a much faster change in value, and that's because the curve, think about placing a band-aid on your nose, and think about the shape that the band-aid makes around the nose, and that is a much faster curve than if you were to place a band-aid on your forehead parallel to the band-aid on your nose. Notice how that curve on the forehead is much more subtle. And so that change in value on the forehead is going to be much more subtle, much more quiet than the change in values on an area such as the nose. Now with my little size 0 round, I'm going to be working the curve of the actual eyeball. I'm going to be working on the eye to the left of the canvas now. The eye gets a little bit darker as it rolls across to the left as it receives less and less light. So let's conceptualize it as just a simple white ball, white marble ball in space relative to a light source. Now that ball has a light and a shadow shape, but the orientation of the eyeball in relative to the eye socket is such that the shadow of the actual eyeball, the white of the eye, known as the sclera, is actually, it's receiving shadow as it rolls across the side of the eye socket. Notice that dark light now just beneath the bottom of the left eye. I believe that is a dark light, not a shadow, so I have to be a little articulate with that value. But as I start to introduce more light into the white of the eye, I'm going to very carefully uh, adjust and modulate the turn and value as it rolls across the side of the eye. I don't want to over model the eye, meaning I don't want to make it too light or too dark, just enough to describe the turn of the white of the eye as the light rolls across that form. And now I'm going to reestablish that highlight. So remember, sometimes you have to push and pull information in order to get the shapes to relate to each other in the way that you want them to. I'm going to be adjusting that value now for the dark light just beneath of the eye. And remember, I tend to go over areas, regions of value several times until I get that relation just right. So I'm trying to make sure that that value remains in the light, yet is still dark enough to be making the form appear as it's turning across the side of the face. It's a very delicate balance between making it too close to the dark of the shadow or too light. So it's a push and pull really between those values. And now I'm going to go right back into the dark now, the dark mass of the hair. I'm going to push it one down just a little bit darker. Still not completely. I'm not trying to make it straight black, because anything that's straight black or straight white tends to jump out at you. So as I move this brush across the dark mass of the hair, I'm trying to still very lightly apply the paint onto the surface, but I'm also trying to make a darker shape such that it gives the effect of hair. That is, I'm leaving some of the brush strokes to show on the bottom, as you can see, just a little bit to indicate the hair that's going to be appearing or emerging out of the light, but just a little bit. With each and every layer of paint that I apply, I'm also going to be increasing the amount of paint that I actually use and how much pressure I apply onto the surface of the canvas as well. And so notice that was the second pass now onto the hair. And now I'm going to switch brushes to my shadow brush. And now I'm going to add another layer onto the shadow side of the face. And notice how I said shadow brush. I'm keeping a separate brush for the large mass of the hair and a separate brush for the shadow side of the face as well. So it's important for me to relate the light and the dark relative to one another. So I'm trying to paint my large masses of value side by side relative to one another so that I can compare one color to the other color. And so now the color of the shadow mass of the hair I noticed is a little bit greener, more on the greenish side than I had initially. Initially I had it a bit too warm, so I'm trying to cool it down a little bit more with this new mixture. And I'm also trying to apply just enough paint so that it reads very quietly in the shadow. And what I mean by that is that I want the shadow to be almost like another dimension in a way that you don't really have too much noise or too much information into the shadow. I just want the shadow to recede away in space. So I painted it with the application of the paint very, very light to the touch so that I wouldn't have too many brush strokes showing in that area. And so now I'm going to work my way into the light region of the face, and of course working my way from the darker values up to the lighter values. I'm now going to be retouching that dark light. Remember, the dark light is the region of value as the light rolls across into the shadow. And so I'm retouching that dark light. I found that it is much warmer than I had it before. It's warmer as it approaches the shadow. I should also note that the direction that I move the brush across the canvas is also due to the fact that I'm trying to eliminate the glaring as much as possible. So this angle that you see me moving the brush often is because of that reason, that I don't want the painting to glare so much. I'm going to be mixing a much deeper halftone now for the region of the face to the left of the mouth, to the left of the canvas, that is. And I'm going to flatten out this plane into just one solid value because I'm now trying to build more articulated values and colors as I progress along the painting now. And now I'm going to be adding on to that flat plane that I had just added with another plane that's just a little bit lighter. And so I'm building my way up the value scale in that manner. I'm not so much thinking about edges right away, though I am softening, of course, some of the edges of the forms on the face right now. But I'm going to consider the overall finish of the edge quality later on in the painting. But right now, I'm just putting a second pass now onto the entire face, trying to, of course, think about the values first in my head, but also now I'm starting to think a little bit more about the color. And now the color of the region, the halftone that I just painted is a little bit more on the neutral greenish pink side, if that makes any sense. I saw it in that way, and not too pink, because now that I'm painting a color onto the lips, I'll be using my more of my pink area of color. Notice how I'm using now my size 0 round brush. For the smaller shapes on the lips, I'm still going to be thinking about planes, and I'm going to be thinking about shapes of light and shadow. Now, just based on my perception of the the structure of the lips, it is my opinion that the side of the lips is actually still in the light, though it's still very dark. I perceive it to be a very dark light. And I believe that the only shadow on the lips themselves, the only shadows are going to be the accents in to the left corner and the right corner of each lip. Notice I'm putting in that dark accent now. Um, I believe that each one of these dark accents, here's the other on the other side of the lip, each one of these accents is a shadow, and I think those are the only shadows actually on the entire structure of the lip. The rest of the lip, I believe, is in light, with the darkest area of the lip to the left receiving a dark light. And now I'm going to be reworking the halftones now as we roll away from the dark light of the side of the face, and still kind of feeling my way around these shapes. I don't believe that I'm going to nail that exact value right away. And so I'm kind of moving my way closer and closer to hopefully the right kind of value relationship. But with the halftone off the side of the face, I'm now adjusting the colors a little bit more. Notice I added more warmth now to that philtrum, the side of the philtrum. Remember, the philtrum is the area uh, connecting the bottom of the nose to the top of the upper lip. And so with each one of these mixtures for the halftones now, I'm starting to add more warmth to the color, and I'm trying to further delineate the value relationships. Notice that brushstroke I just applied was a little bit warmer, but it was also a little lighter in value. I perceive that area to have a little bit of a lighter halftone than the other areas of the painting. And now I'm rolling my way around to the bottom of the chin. I'm trying to make the value relationships much more solid now as I roll across the side of the face in this second layer of paint. And I'm also trying to add a little bit more warmth now, because there will be a little more warmth as we roll closer to the shadow. Now, for the background, I see the background, I perceive it to be a little bit cooler than the flesh color. Remember, I try to relate the colors relative to one another, and I think that the background is cooler than the flesh tones, but it's also, the hue is also a little bit more, I believe, on the greenish side. So now I'm going to fill in the background with this color mixture and put a little bit of my ultramarine blue and raw umber for the shirt, for the dark of the shirt, just a little bit of color for the shirt there. And now I'm going to keep on adding more planes and more color variations onto the face. Picking and choosing different areas to render and other areas to leave a little more unfinished. So as we roll across the side of the face here, I'm once again re-establishing that plane. I'm trying to make it darker as it rolls across the form into the shadow. And a little bit darker here also on the corner of the chin. I'm just trying to further modulate these values so that the illusion of form will start to happen. And of course I'm trying to build these values still relative to one another, but with these further layers of paint, I seek to further and further refine the value relationships that I had in the previous layer, and perhaps see different colors and different forms that I hadn't seen before as well. And after indicating those planes that I wanted to place in there, to build in there, all I had to do was soften the edge a little bit with the application of paint. And now let's move on to the smaller shapes, particularly this smaller shape on the bottom of the nostril that's starting to receive more light. With my little size 0 round brush, I'm going to be now carefully applying the color onto this form, and I'm still trying to give as much respect to the smaller shapes as I did with the larger shapes. That meaning that I'm picking and choosing different areas of light to be a given value based on where I think that they are in relation to the light source. And I'm also trying to maintain that large family, that large value family relationship as well. I'm not trying to make any of the lights in the bottom of the bulb of the nose uh, too light. I want it to gradate and get a little bit darker as the form of the nose rolls underneath. But remember, I don't think that it's in shadow, so it's going to be gradually turning away from the light and getting a little bit darker. That area of the bottom of the nose. And the other side of the nose is going to be receiving a little bit of light as well. And so now I'm going to build up some of the light on the nose. I'm pretty much using the same color combinations that I had mixed for the light side of the face on the right side. If you recall that clip, remember I said that the right side was a little bit lighter. And so I'm pretty much using the same color for this area now. And I'm just going to uh, push or scumble the paint now around the side of the nostril to soften that edge a little bit. I'm going to very carefully now build this edge, or build this transition from the highlight of the nose as it rolls across to the shadow plane. And I'm going to do that by introducing a value in the middle, and then going to go back over it with a soft, dry sable brush. It's a pretty old sable brush that I have here, and I'm just going to push it ever so slightly. You can kind of think of it as blending, but I'm just trying to soften that edge just a little bit. Notice I created that value first with the paintbrush, and then I started softening it. And I'm going to do the same thing on the side of the nostril. I'm going to soften that region of value so that the nostril doesn't jump out too much. And so softening this transition helps with the overall dimension and volume of the painting. Notice that the painting is a little bit more volumetric now as the edges start to get softer and softer on the forms of the face. Now remember I mentioned earlier that the lips, the only shadows on the lips that I believe were there are the accents from the top lip meeting the bottom lip. And so I'm going to go ahead and reestablish those accents onto the lips now. And something different with this painting is that I'm also seeing a little bit of the white of the teeth, just a little white glimpse of the teeth. And oftentimes artists struggle showing just a little glimpse of the model's teeth. And it should be thought of in the same way that you think of the rest of the painting, no different. I'm just going to first put in the dark lights once again around the side of the lip, following from the darker accents of the two lips meeting each other. And I'm going to build the structure of the two lips first, touching one another as it rolls across the side of the face. And then with my little tiny size 0 round brush, I'm going to use some of the flake white, a little bit of the sap green actually, to cool down the flesh tone color that you see me mixing right now, to create a cooler and lighter band of value that I'm going to use across the white region where the teeth will be showing. But it's just a glimpse of the teeth showing, as you can see. And so I'm going to go ahead and overstate that value and that shape, made it a little bit bigger than it needs to be, so that I can come back in with another brush and further articulate what that shape should look like. And with another little size 0 round, I'm starting to mix a little bit of alizarin crimson into the warmer flesh tones that I had. And I'm going to use that to further articulate the shape of the lips, the bottom lip to be exact, as it starts to create the shape encompassing the white of the teeth that is actually showing. Remember that it's not going to be straight white. I know we want to be really quick to paint any kind of teeth that we see as straight white, but remember it's also existing in a three-dimensional realm where it's not directly facing the light. So yes, the teeth are white, but it's not facing the light directly. So it's going to be not gray nor pink. Like I said, I mixed a little bit of the sap green and my lead white into the flesh tone mixture to get that color and to get that value for the teeth. And as I continue to add more shapes onto the lips, I want to be careful not to lose the overall value relationship. Now remember that I perceive the lips to be entirely in light with only the accents, the two dark accents that I mentioned before, where the two lips are facing each other, to be in shadow. So those are the only two little dots of shadow, if you will, and the rest is in the light. So all I'm doing really is just further softening that edge between the half tone and the light on the bottom of the lip. The values on the lip are very subtle as they curve around the side of the face. Very subtle. And now I'm going to just slightly scumble on the light of the bottom lip using the same, pretty much the same color that I had for the highlight on the top of the nose. So that pretty much does it. If we can figure out, first and foremost, the light and shadow shapes, then figure out the large value families in relation to one another, and then subdivide those larger families of value and color into smaller families of value and color, all we really have to do to finish this off is to soften the edges, particularly the edges around the side of the face as we roll into the shadow, and some of the edges on the face. Now the model is fairly young, so there are not going to be too many hard edges on the face, as you can imagine. And so that pretty much does it. I'm going to add just a few little extra areas of light onto the clavicle bone, but the region of the neck I'm going to leave largely unfinished. The value is in general going to be a lot darker than the face, so I'm going to let that value be a little bit darker, but I'm not going to finish too many of the forms onto the neck. And with that, that just about wraps up this week's portrait painting demonstration. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it helps you out, and stay tuned for next week's video. Thank you.